Okay, folks, we are about to get started, so please find a seat.
You said it all right.
Yeah, it's happening. All right. Okay. Chop off my head. Okay, welcome everyone to the Harvard. You know why you're here.
Yes.
But for propriety's sake, I will say it. Welcome to the Harvard Gender and Sexuality Caucus Author Forum with Michelle Lerner and Jonathan Vatt. My name is Greg Newton. My partner's name is Donnie Jokum, and we are the co-founders of the Bureau of General Services Queer Division. And the Bureau is the space you're in now, in case you didn't know. The Bureau is something we founded back in 2012, and we've been here since 2014, here being the LGBT Community Center. So you're within a space within a space. So the Bureau is an independent, all-volunteer queer bookstore, and our regular business hours are Wednesdays through Sundays from 1 to 7 p.m. We often stay open later on weekdays, especially for events, and we have a very busy calendar, which you can check out on our website, bgsqd.com. And if you're interested in signing up for our bi-weekly newsletter, you can also do that on the website, bgsqd.com, or back by the window in the back, and you'll get a newsletter every other Monday about many upcoming events. As an all-volunteer independent bookstore, we are dependent on both sales and donations to keep this project going. So I'm going to pass a bag around. We especially encourage people to donate if you know you won't be buying a book. You're welcome to donate and buy a book, but and if you can't do either, we still love you. So there's cash change in here. There's also a QR code on the back if you'd like to give through Venmo. And those of you watching online, if you would like to donate via Venmo, you can do so at BGSQD. So before I welcome Adam up to the stage, I wanted to read a land acknowledgement. So the Bureau acknowledges that our organization operates on the unceded land of the Munsee Lenape. We encourage you to join the Bureau in signing up to make a monthly donation to the American Indian Community Houses Mannahatta Fund. The Mannahatta Fund, according to its website, is an invitation to all settlers and non-Native people who wish to acknowledge the legacy of theft and genocide that comprise the history of New York City and the United States. And you can find out more at mannahattafund.org. And now it is my pleasure to welcome Adam Robbins, the NYC coordinator for the Harvard Gender and Sexuality Caucus.
Thank you, Greg, and welcome to the first HGSC NYC Author Forum of 2025. Let's thank the Bureau of General Services Queer Division for hosting us at no cost. So please do make a donation, make a purchase as you can. I'm Adam Robbins, as he mentioned, the New York City coordinator for the Harvard Gender and Sexuality Caucus, a group for LGBTQ alums to stay connected in the city. And I am excited to introduce today's authors. Michelle Lerner is a recovering public interest lawyer. She's currently emerging from late-stage Lyme disease, living with her family in rural New Jersey. She earned an MFA in poetry from the New School and now directs the Laura Boss Poetry Foundation. Her writing has appeared in anthologies and journals like Shenandoah, Lips, and VQR. She's author of the 2021 Poetry Chapbook Protection, as well as the novel that brings us here today, Ring. Michelle is joined by Jonathan Vattner, author of The Bridesmaid Union and Carnegie Hill. His fiction has earned praise from People, Town and Country, the New York Post, the Los Angeles Review of Books. He is managing editor of Hue, the magazine of the Fashion Institute of Technology, and he teaches fiction writing at the New York University and the Hudson Valley Writing Center. Stick around after the discussion for snacks and gluten-free cake. Both authors will be on hand to sign copies of their book. And if you know other great authors in the city, let me know. We're always looking for ways to connect and elevate our community. And now, without further ado.
Sure. Thanks everyone for coming. It's a really special book and a really special afternoon.
Thank you, Jonathan and Adam, for organizing this. Thank you for HGSC and the Bureau for hosting it. And thank you to all of you for coming. This is the launch of this book, and this is my debut fiction, and this is the first time I'm reading from this book publicly. This is the first time I'm reading fiction publicly. This is my first fiction. I'm mostly a poet, great writing. I'm going to read for about 15 minutes or so, just a little bit of background about the book. It's written from first-person point of view. The protagonist is a middle-aged, non-binary parent from the Midwest named Lee, who at the beginning of the book has lost their young adult daughter to uncertain circumstances. And is really struggling with grief to the point that they feel like they cannot go on, and they're attracted to and then traveling to a sanctuary in northern Ontario that has the purpose of helping people with terminal illness to end their lives. And when they get there, they meet somebody who has gone to the sanctuary for this purpose, who has brought their dog with them. And because the way that people end their lives at the sanctuary is to eventually go out on a walk into the snow from which there is no return. The presence of this dog is disconcerting to the protagonist, and that's sort of one of the precipitating conflicts of the book. So I'm going to read, the book is not, it's written unconventionally, it's not in chapters, it's in vignettes, which are these short scenes. I'm going to read the prologue, which is a few paragraphs and written differently than the rest of the book, and then the very first vignette, and then portions of a few other vignettes from the first part of the book. Prologue. Snow. Taking that first step out of the hut sounded more difficult than what would come after. Of course, this was just speculation. It's not like I could ask someone at the final pillar as they took their penultimate breath. Which seemed harder to me, leaving my apartment, or whatever might happen in those last seconds that lighten the body by 0.7 of an ounce? Did it matter? I had a friend once who was almost 98. He had a tumor in his lung. He wanted to talk to me about what his last moments might be like. I told him I was sure he had time left. Now I wondered why I couldn't talk to him when the last moments he was asking me to imagine were his, not mine. I guess I thought no one was ever ready. Not at 98, not with cancer, not even the suicides. The first section is called Before Sanctuary. Union Station. Union Station in Winnipeg was huge. Entering through the glass doors at the bottom of the concrete facade, I had the sense of walking through a portal. The space inside was open, round, and clean, with a high circular skylight that looked like a miniature firmament sitting on the globe of the waiting room. I don't know what I'd been expecting, but I suppose something quiet and discreet, something out of the way. Winnipeg was not that place. I had a few hours before the train left for Churchill. There were no empty benches, and I was so exhausted I considered lying down on the floor. Instead, I sat on a bench occupied only by an elderly woman in the hope that once she left, I could lie down or at least rest there against my backpack. On the plane ride here, I'd felt no fear, at least not of flying. I had always been so scared of it until the trip last summer to claim Rachel's body. On that flight, I had barely noticed being in the air. But I hadn't been sure if that was just due to the shock or what to expect on the flight yesterday from Madison to Winnipeg. So I'd carried my bottle of Xanax in my pocket, planning to take as much as I needed before the final leg of my trip to Attawapiskat, at which point I would throw away the rest. The Seven Pillars Society doesn't allow tranquilizers. This trip was the first time I'd left the apartment since the funeral. In truth, I'd hardly been out of bed in months. I couldn't even find the energy to stand in the shower, had resorted to getting into a bathtub when required by exasperated friends who stopped by to try to get food into my mouth and stench off my body. What I remember most about the months after Rachel's death was the olive and white of the apartment walls and the rough woven texture of the mustard-colored curtains in the bedroom. The feel of the comforter between my fingers as I pulled it over my skin, often as a shield against Susan's constant repetition of all the minutiae we knew about Rachel's last day. I'd begun taking the Xanax all the time. It was no longer just for flying. But yesterday, on the flight to Winnipeg, I'd found I didn't need it. Fear of flying has to do with fear of death. After Rachel died, I guess this fear just disappeared. When the plane landed, I tossed the pills. It didn't take long for me to realize that was a mistake. After the flight, as I lay in the hotel bed, unable to sleep, I remembered that you're not supposed to suddenly stop taking medication like that it has to be tapered, that it can even be dangerous to stop cold turkey. There was nothing I could do about it at that point. I was already used to being awake on and off during the night. I hadn't had a normal circadian rhythm since Rachel's death. I was rarely awake or asleep more than 3 or 4 hours in a row. Though I'd lived through many days since my daughter died, I couldn't admit they were of the same nature as when she was alive, similar length, similar weather, that I was moving through the doors of the same successive hours as the people I saw walking by the window of my apartment. The days seemed to pass through me rather than the other way around. I slept drug-induced at odd times. The hours stood still on top of me, little demons with weights pinning me to the bed. The stillness wasn't natural, but it was complete. Somehow my chest had continued to move and air entered my lungs, my only source of amazement for months. But in the hotel room last night, without the Xanax, the feeling was different. It was a clearer-headed, pulse-racing awakeness that was not just an interlude between sleep, but something actively opposed to sleep. I lay there at least half the night with my heart pounding in my chest. The snow outside the window had calmed me. It was dark, but I could see it coming down, feathery and light against the glass. There was a bright blur in the sky that could only have been the moon behind clouds. The benefit of not falling asleep had been avoiding the moments after waking when I'd usually forget and then remember. Rachel. There was before Rachel and there was after Rachel. There were 23 years in between, the 23 years that were Rachel. When they found her car in the desert, Susan was convinced Border Patrol was responsible for her death. Rachel was working with a grassroots group driving food and water to migrants and was proud of her work. Then we stopped hearing from her. Then they found her car. Then they found her. The investigation by local law enforcement found no evidence of anyone else's involvement and ruled it an accident or suicide, with heat exhaustion the cause of death. That Rachel had either been affected by the heat while trying to get to a particular spot to meet someone, or that she had just walked out into the desert alone as a way to kill herself. Susan didn't believe any of it, was sure the investigation was tainted because of Border Control's likely involvement, that Rachel wouldn't have done this to herself, that she had left no note, that she was experienced in the desert and the desert heat and couldn't possibly have been so careless as to strand herself and succumb to heat exhaustion. It's hard to explain, but by that time it almost didn't matter what had actually happened. I was devastated to the marrow of my bones. There was nothing left. She was gone. She had walked through some door willingly or unwillingly. The need to understand why eventually ran itself aground in the stunned silence inside my head. There were no longer meaningful points of view, things to comprehend or argue about. There were just ideas like piles of sand that people moved from here to there, separated out into smaller piles, stood in front of, gave names to, fought about. I would say I stepped around them, except I hardly got out of bed. Because really, the piles were made of quicksand. Minuscule, nondescript, meaningless spots of quicksand all around my bed. Susan and the other people entering the apartment dragged them in. My bed was solid, so I stayed there and looked at the ceiling while they talked in the other rooms. I don't remember if I got up when Susan moved her last box out the door. To be honest, I don't really remember her leaving. Sometimes I try to think of Susan before and during Rachel, because it doesn't seem fair to only think about the way she acted after. But every time I try, all I see is the drawn skin on her face, the plowed furrows on her forehead, the lines at the sides of her eyes and mouth. For every rung I climbed down inside myself after Rachel died, Susan climbed up and out, anger emanating from her the way heat rises off the pavement in August. There must have been a moment when we crossed each other's latitude. Maybe it was the day they found Rachel's body, since I remember Susan's fingers gripping the flesh of my sides. I know she wailed, but in my memory she was silent, her mouth large and moving without sound, her fingers gripping me tight. After that, we lived in 2 different climates. I've been told everyone grieves differently, which presupposes that each person is still there, intact in their personhood and personality, engaging in the action of grieving as an experience or a process. But I think grief takes its own form as it consumes a person from the inside, devouring whatever pre-existed. However it looks from the outside depends on how fast it does the devouring, how completely, and with what kind of energy. By the end, Susan and I were just vessels for grief, its fingers reaching out through our previously human bodies. In Susan's body, the grief was hot and could not stop running. In me, it was a glacier, and the ice filling me became me. Cold to the bone, there was too little of me remaining to stand in her way as she left. I'm gonna skip about 20 pages and just read a few sections of a couple of vignettes that introduce a few of the characters having to do with the sanctuary. So in between what I read and this part, Lee travels to the sanctuary and is approaching the sanctuary after flying to a remote village called Atawapiskat and driving on an ice road. And this last part is on a snowmobile with someone named Shamu, who is one of the people that runs the sanctuary. Shamu is a Hungarian nickname for Samuel. Sanctuary. Eventually, the light faded to black on all sides except straight ahead in the path of the headlights, and above our heads where the stars were clear as lit matches. How Shamu knew that where he was going was a mystery. All that lay ahead, as far as I could tell, was snow, and now snow was falling as well. At some point, after so many breaths into the vibrating night air, a hulking shape appeared in front of the lights, first small and nondescript, and then expanding in size until it became a wide rectangular one-story building with strange protrusions off to the left side. Shamu slowed the snowmobile and pulled up to a lighted door. Standing in front of it was a woman with short black curly hair, light brown skin, and a slight padding of weight on her cheeks and torso. She wore a luminescent purple shirt under a heavy gray cardigan, and on opening the door asked me to come in quickly so as not to let the heat out. And this is Catherine, who also runs the sanctuary. There's some discussion of the sanctuary. Before I could say I just wanted to go to bed, she was gone. As I contemplated laying down on the couch, someone came out of the passageway, or rather more than one someone. An angular, balding white man who looked like he was in his 60s entered with a dog following close behind him. The man had a thin rim of gray hair, and his skin looked lightly tanned, almost yellowish. The dog kind of resembled a border collie, slender with longish black and white fur, and the outline of a white circle set off against the black on one side, short ears that flopped over, and a penetrating gaze directed right at me. It stayed within inches of the man's legs. I felt a new pain in my chest looking at the dog, though I didn't know why. The man walked up to me. "You must be Lee. Catherine told me you'd get here this afternoon. I'm Robert, and this is Ring." Robert and Ring. Robert sat down on a chair facing me. Ring jumped on the couch next to me and lay down, pushing the side of his body against my leg. I must have looked surprised because Robert said, "Please excuse him. He doesn't leave my side unless someone else's side is available." I looked down at Ring, who seemed to have settled in for a nap. I put my hand on his head and slowly dragged my fingers down his neck and back, parting the fur in little rivulets. He sighed. Robert said he needed to help cook dinner in the kitchen, which was just off this room, and if it was okay, he'd leave Ring with me. Once he realizes there's food in the picture, he might follow me. But Catherine doesn't let me give him scraps in there, so he's mostly lost interest in the production side of dining. I didn't say anything, and Robert stood up to leave. "Before you ask," he said, "pancreatic cancer." He stood looking at me. "I'm sorry," I said. A look of slight disappointment drifted across his face. "Don't be sorry," he offered. "This place has helped me a lot. I've done a lot of healing." "You're healing?" I asked, surprised. "The cancer's going away?" "No, that's not what I meant." His brows furrowed as he shook his head. "The cancer won't go away. I'm walking the pillars in a couple of weeks while I'm still able." I looked at him again and he turned to leave, saying, "I'm sorry, you just arrived. You don't need to know the state of my organs. It's normally everyone's first question, so I get it out of the way. I'll see you at dinner." And with that, Robert left the room. Ring's head jerked up as he watched Robert disappear through the passageway. At first, he seemed a little anxious, almost like he was holding his breath, and I thought he might jump up and follow Robert. But instead, he turned and looked at me expectantly, like I'd been in the middle of a sentence and he wanted me to finish it. I put my hand back on his head and told him, "I'm Lee. What's a nice dog like you doing in a place like this?" Satisfied, Ring sighed again, dropped his head back down to the couch, closed his eyes, and fell asleep.
Excuse me. So I'm going to ask some questions of Michelle, and then I'll open up for questions from the audience. Ring, it's such a dark book, and it's so. But what I want to say is
Everyone tells me it's hopeful.
But what I want to
Don't read it. It's really, really bleak.
What I was gonna say is that it's not bleak at all. It's so hopeful and beautiful, and I just wanted to stay in this world as long as I could. But I'm curious what drew you to this material. What made you want to write the book, and what made you brave enough to stay with the darkness?
I live there. I mean, I think a few things came together. This probably sound odd because I wasn't really a fiction writer until recently, but I used to commute an hour and 45 minutes each way into Greater Boston Legal Services, and I would kind of think of stories in my head that I would think, oh, I'm gonna write about that at some point when I'm no longer a lawyer. And one of the bones of this story kind of came to me out of nowhere as I just saw somebody walking in the snow out to sort of end their life by these pillars, which I didn't know what they were, and that they come across a dog and have to figure out what to do. Like, what do you do when you're sort of on your way to end your life and you find a dog? And that just sort of sat in the back of my head for probably a couple of decades. And then when I started to write, I really wanted to write a book about grief, specifically about complicated grief, which is grief that is so disabling that it interferes with daily life. And I think, technically the definition is that it goes on for more than a year. I've experienced this in the past, and I know of other people who've experienced it, and apparently more than 1 million Americans experience this every year. And I think it's really not talked about very much in this culture and really not understood. And when I was going through it, I definitely felt, even from people close to me, like a very strong pressure to sort of get over it, even though it's not very clear how to get over something like that. And one of the common elements of this kind of grief is a type of, it's partially from missing the person, but it's also a type of survivor's guilt where you feel like you should die also because the person that you love died. And a lot of times that's sort of an ambiguous, more passive feeling, like I think it was with me, but I really wanted to write about that, and to do that, I felt like I sort of needed to make it concrete, but to me, the main question is really, why, one of the main questions that propelled me to write the book was, why is it that some people react this way and other people don't? And when you are experiencing something like that, what is it that makes it worth living or going on? Like, what does that take?
So Lee, the main character, goes to this sanctuary, as Michelle said, and it's a place where people go to sort of prepare emotionally to die, to take their life. And when I was writing to Michelle, saying, "Oh, I love the book, this," and I referred to the sanctuary as a wellness center. I have to say, it's like really appealing.
Actually, I think you said weird wellness retreat.
Wellness retreat. There was something so beautiful and appealing about it, and I was wondering, and then I found out that it doesn't exist. I was wondering how you came up with
Please
that.
tell me you knew it didn't exist.
I knew,
Okay.
but I wanted it to exist. How did you come up with that, and how did you get the details so precise?
First of all, I had to have some explanation for the pillars in the snow, right? Like, I had the bones of the story, and what, I kind of had to figure out what it meant. But in the years before I wrote this, what actually gave me space to write this book was that I got very sick for years, and I'm still sick, and I had to stop practicing law, which I'd wanted to do for a really long time, but couldn't ever seem to get myself to. Some people in the front are laughing because I think for probably about 20 years I was like, I think I'm going to stop practicing law. But when I was sick, it took a long time to get properly diagnosed with neurological Lyme disease, and I was really failed a lot by conventional medicine, and I did a lot of these weird kind of treatments that some of them really helped me, and also made me realize, I experienced a lot of anxiety and depression like coming from the illness, but not knowing what was going on. My brain was also inflamed, and something I really learned through the process of going through these different kinds of treatments was that we hold trauma in our body a lot, and that there's so much focus in this culture, and I don't want to denigrate this at all. I've also done this, with sort of talk therapy, and but that a lot of depression, anxiety, and other things that come from trauma are held in our bodies and can't really be dealt with without dealing with our bodies. And so I wanted to write about that while also writing about grief, and also this weird vision I had of the person in the snow with the pillars, and the sanctuary just seemed like the way to do that. And I did not think of it as a wellness center, but it kind of is, actually.
It seemed very healthy. And like one of the pleasures of the book is watching Lee sort of emerge from their fog through these many meditations and practices and meals and the community. One thing that is notable about the book, but that may be not apparent when you first read it, is that Lee is non-binary. And I'm wondering why you chose that for them, and how you got it right. How you researched and wrote a character who is non-binary.
I guess there's a few answers to that. for one thing, just like sort of the main story came to me, like these characters kind of came to me fully formed, which I was a poet, which is mostly sort of about my own life. And when I started writing and having these characters sort of that I felt like were kind of telling me where the story was going and who they were, and I was wondering if I was mentally ill. But then I started talking to other fiction writers, and apparently this is just what happens. Like, this is how you discover you're a fiction writer. Like and so Lee just made sense. Lee just was non-binary, for one thing. But I have several non-binary kids in my life who are now teenagers, and I was also very acutely aware of lack of non-binary representation in literature, and there have been some books with non-binary main characters coming out in recent years, very recently, and most of them seem to be young adult fiction or romance or fantasy or science fiction. And I want the kids in my life who are non-binary to have non-binary characters in literary fiction. And I also think it's important to have representation both for genderqueer people and queer people in general, where the plot is not about that, right? Like, we all have other things in our lives, and I just wanted it to be part of who this character was and not an issue in the book. And because I feel like that's what I want the kids in my life to be able to read. And in terms of getting it right, like, I have non-binary people I'm very close to and have sort of gone through this, but I also, I'm very neurotic. I got multiple sensitivity reads of various kinds for my book, and one of them I got a non-binary adult author to do a sensitivity read for that also, who I think suggested that I change language like once or twice in the book, and I did.
I also had sensitivity reads for both of my books, and it was really helpful, and like a little relieving, I think. Let's talk about Ring. The Ring is the dog character. Did you have a dog? Do you have a dog? It felt like it was like one of those characters, one of those elements of the book that like made me so happy and yet so terrified because this dog, Robert, means to take the dog's life as well. How did tell me about your experience with dogs. From beginning to end.
I've had a bunch of dogs in my life, and in fact, Ring is kind of based on one of them who is like genius level dog, but she was really badly behaved. So like Ring is not. She's an inspiration for Ring, but if Ring had acted like that dog, like the story would have really gone off the rails. I guess what was the question?
It just seems like you must have had dogs or loved dogs.
I mean, I've had intense and really important relationships in my life with various animals that I think have saved me in different ways. And I wanted to, the story did come to me with a dog in it. And I don't think this would have worked with like a cat or a chicken or a sheep. It's also really important to me, if there was going to be if the dog is an important part of the story, that the dog be a character and not a prop. I feel like I have full relationships with non-human animals with, like actual communication, not in English, but, and so I feel like, if there's a character that is a dog or another animal, they should be a fully developed character where you understand what it is that they're feeling and communicating.
Yeah, it's a very sweet portrayal. One more question for me, and then if you all have questions, please ask. A large part of the book is about the indigenous community that lives really where the sanctuary is based, the land it's on, and I just wondered sort of why it was important to you to include that element of the book and how you did that research as well.
Yeah, that's actually an interesting story because the original manuscript, I mean, I wouldn't say it's a main part of the book, I think it's an important part of the book, but the original manuscript did not have much about Attawapiskat in it. The reason Attawapiskat came up was that when I first sat down to write and still just had this very basic outline for this book, I looked on a map to try to figure out where in the real world it could possibly make sense to set this, a place that's isolated enough for what needs to happen, but where somebody from the US or the Midwest US could theoretically actually get to. And I found a place on the map, and part of the reason it works is that there's this remote Cree community, Attawapiskat, with an airport that people can fly into. And to be honest, the original manuscript, and up until the point I got an agent, mostly portrayed that community as the place where the airport was. And there was a little bit of time spent there, but there wasn't a significant character. And the reason is that I was afraid to write much about it. There's, there's a lot of controversy in Canada and here, and I think for good reason, about non-Indigenous authors writing Indigenous characters. And I didn't want to do anything presumptuous. And when I got my agent, and she was giving me what are called notes, which sound very nice, but anybody who's gotten an agent, when you first get notes, you feel like you want to go bury yourself in a ditch somewhere. My agent gave me 2 hours of notes on the first manuscript. But one of the things she said was, you need a significant character from this community, and you need to talk about this community more, because what you're doing is erasing it. You're pretending that it's not there and that it's okay. Sorry, I'm actually feeling emotional because this connects to a lot of other things that I work on in my life. What you're doing is you're pretending that you can just use this space that is in this community's traditional land while pretending that they're not really there. And, part of the way that settler colonialism works is by pretending that people that live in a place are not there. And I'd been afraid, but when she said that, I realized literature should not be complicit in that. And, she said, just do a good job. So, so I tried to, this was not a place I could go to, partially because I'm sick and it's very hard to get to, and partially because most of the writing I did was during the pandemic, and Attawapiskat was literally locked down, nobody could fly in or out of it. So I read as much as I could, and I watched some films and documentaries, and what became very apparent to me was that there's a lot of mainstream media writing about this community in Canada, and it's pretty insulting. I mean, there's a lot of crises there, but they are government-made crises, and the things that people from the community were writing and saying and making in movies were very different. And so what was really important to me was to base, the character Matt from there and the things that happened there, pretty much entirely on what people from the community had written or said or in movies. And then I got 3 sensitivity reads. And the first one was from, I convinced this really amazing author, Canadian author, Frank Bush. He's from the Northern Cree community. He wrote a book called Gray Eyes. And he's not a sensitivity reader by profession, but I convinced him to do this for me. And he spent hours on Zoom with me, just sort of talking. And, he suggested that I change a few pretty small things, but he also he gave me a lot of instructions, actually. Like he would that added a lot of local flavor, community. Like he would literally say, in this scene, you need to add that this person walks in and asks him for his snowmobile keys, and this is why, and this is the point you need to make with this. And there are probably 5 or 6 things in the book that he like literally told me, like, you have to add this to the book. So by the end of it, I felt, pretty, it's such an integral part of the story at this point that it's kind of hard for me to imagine that I had a book without it. But it was a long process, like kind of mentally. Before you ask, can I ask you a question?
Sure, of course.
When you said something about, it struck me as funny the way you phrased it, but when you were talking about the book being really dark and like how I was brave enough to stay in that space, like, and I know we've talked about this a little bit, but I read Carnegie Hill, and I know that the blurbs on the front of it are like hilarious and charming and buoyant, and I honestly don't know how you didn't have like mobs of people like trying to burn your home down like from that, and then reading the book, because the book, which is amazing, it's a really good book, is really dark. Like,
part of why I said that was because originally Carnegie Hill was a book about death and mortality, and then my agent was like, nah.
It still is.
So it still is, but it's kind of wrapped in this comedy. I didn't actually know it was funny until people would just tell me, like, this is hilarious. But yeah, it is very dark. And so the one thing I asked when they were doing the cover design, I was like, I don't want it to be a cartoon. Like, I don't want it to be a drawing. I want it to be a photograph. So what did they do? So it's a drawing, and it looks like
jaunty.
I hate this term chicklet, but I was like, this is like high-end chicklet. So yes, but I think there is some bravery in like just holding to darkness, because like I was in it in parts, but then I pull out, and there's just all these different elements that kind of are also happening, I guess. And I think like the feeling in the publishing world is like people don't want to read, something that just like holds their head in something dark and intense. But I have to say, like, you pulled it off beautifully. It was an exploration of humanity of all kinds. And I didn't feel sad. I felt sadness, but the reading, the experience as a whole was uplifting. But you can also buy my books.
I recommend Carnegie Hill.
Okay, well, shall we, yeah.
Hi, Michelle.
Hey, Brom.
It's been a while, huh? Here's my question. I want to move away from content for a second and ask you about the editorial process that you went through from about 2023, when we had learned that your publisher was on this. So the time it was actually published, and to what extent did you have editorial control over the narrative, and to what extent, if any, you had to make changes to the book to suit a commercial need or viability of the publisher?
Oh, and Michelle, would you repeat the questions for the people on Zoom? So not, verbatim.
Oh,
you know what I mean.
so the question, and it's interesting because it comes from Cole, who's in my writing group and who actually did a lot more editing probably with this book than my publisher did. But the question was, once it was with the publisher, what was the editing process like, and did I need to change anything or compromise anything, and like for commercial, to make it more commercial?
Yeah, were you in control?
Was I in control? Yeah. So because I'm neurotic, and because I had a really good writing group, and I had, 20 people read this book before I, and a really good agent, my agent did a lot of helpful developmental editing with me. By the time it got to my publisher, it was like just incredibly lightly edited. It was almost just copy edited. And when he offered on the book, he said that would be the case. and I definitely had complete control over it. But that said, this is with a small press, and my agent tried to get the book published by, Big Five publisher, she's with a big agency and they don't work with small presses. And that went on for like a year and a half, I think. It went through various rounds, and we got all these really complimentary responses from editors, basically saying, this is a beautiful book, I loved it, thank you so much for letting me read it, can't wait to see who publishes it. And a few of them said outright, this is not commercial enough for our press, either because of the content, or one of the editors literally said, the fact that it's not written in chapters and it's written in vignettes makes this, we can't publish this, but it works for this book and I wouldn't want it to change. So I didn't make changes to make it more commercial, but the more commercial publishers didn't want it because it wasn't commercial enough. So,
And I should just add, anyone who's not been through the whole publishing thing, everyone thinks that the hardest thing is getting an agent, and in some ways that is the hardest, but when the book goes out on submission, it was the worst part of my life, just waiting for the axe to fall. And I had a whole round of rejections, and I just thought it was very, very, very hard.
yeah, I actually, I was surprised how anxiety producing it was when the agent started sending it out, and I started doing searches online about that process, and I found this listserv for authors with agents whose books were out on submission, and the listserv is called The Next Circle of Hell.
It's imagine mailing your beating heart out, and then it's just a bunch of people with knives.
Well, especially because if you have an agent, they're always this is gonna be the one, and then, and then you wait 5 months and get, a paragraph back or something,
Yeah.
I have a question about your experience with a background primarily as a poet, your experience of writing fiction. Anything about it that surprised you? Any ways in which being a poet informed the writing of the book?
So the question was how being a poet informed the writing of the book, and if there's anything about writing fiction that surprised me as a poet. And I have to say, I think part of the reason the book is written a little bit unconventionally is because I'm a poet and I wasn't a fiction writer. I think that's the whole vignette thing. It wasn't I set out to do this radical thing or anything. I really literally couldn't figure out how to write chapters. It just kind of came out this way. I think the thing, well, a couple of things. One thing that really surprised me again was this sense of these characters that seemed like real people that were, I would sit down and have an idea of where the story was going and the character would end up doing something else, and that never happened in a poem before. But also, I think that the fact that I was a poet and not a fiction writer, I really wanted to write novels, and part of the reason I didn't was that I think I felt like I needed to know how to do it. That I'd gotten an MFA and it was in poetry. I'd never taken a fiction class in my life. I'd read fiction. I felt like I had to know how to map it out and do chapter structures and have backstory in the right way and a linear, and what happened is I read in 2019, I picked up a book of essays by Susan Sontag, Against Interpretation, and there's an essay in there, I think it's Against Interpretation, that talks about the fact that fiction writers and people who write novels had not developed in the same way as other arts in terms of breaking down the historical structure of what they're doing, and that a lot of what we consider necessary for a novel, like chapters and backstory and linearity and character development, are just sort of what happened in the development of the novel, and that it doesn't have to be that way, and that people should play with these things and get rid of some of them. And this was in the 60s, like I read it in 2019. Oh wow! But I finished that essay and I opened my computer and started the book. And I don't think I would have felt like I could write fiction if I hadn't read that essay.
Yeah.
I just saw the cover of the book and the dog, it looks like an Australian Shepherd dog. I was wondering why does it have to be that dog? Because, we talk about, we feel the darkness, but then you said, I felt like it's hopeful. So I was wondering, is there some connection between that dog and the feeling of hope? I have a dog, so I know the feeling of, having a dog and, being hopeful. I was just wondering if that's related to your novel.
I'm not sure I entirely understand the question. Are you asking if having the dog in the story is related to the novel being hopeful, or the specific way that the dog is portrayed?
That's the two things that I'm asking.
In terms of the specific way the dog is portrayed, I think I imagine the dog sort of as like a mutt that looked like a border collie to some extent. Partially because they tend to be incredibly smart, and partially because of my dog, my badly behaved dog, but very smart dog, who kind of inspired this. But yeah, in terms of the hopeful side of the book, I think part of what was important to me in the story, and I think part of why it came to me fully formed the way it did about somebody kind of walking off to try to kill themselves and finding a dog, is the conflict or the concept of what it means to want to take care of somebody when you don't feel like taking care of yourself, or you feel like you don't have anything to live for. That is like, what does it mean to care about somebody else? Like if you really feel like there's no reason to live. And that only, with this character in the story, that only made sense to me with an animal, like with a dog. Like the way, the headspace that this character is in, they would not have gotten into that kind of situation with another human, I don't think.
Any other questions?
I have one. Knowing Michelle for just a short period, I know this year has been so tough, right? And I'm just now it occurred to me, like, how the hell did you write this? Like, when did you have time for the mental space? Was it mostly written before?
You obviously have not tried to publish books. This was done way before the war started. It takes, from the time that the publisher.
Maybe asking about the chronology of things.
Yeah, I think I started writing it in 2019, and I'm trying to remember when I finished it. I stopped for a while because one of my closest friends died in 2020, and I just didn't feel able to keep writing it. And then I finished it, and then, I went through a torturous process because I didn't really even think that it was something that could get published. I sent it off randomly to some manuscript contests, and it was like a finalist or shortlisted for all of them. And one, which was very surprising to me, and then one of them said, "You need to get an agent." That's what, so I queried agents, and then I got an agent, and then it was with the agent, then the agent said, you need to, it was 48,000, this is how not a fiction writer I was, it was 48,000 words, and apparently that is not a publishable length of anything. A novella is up to 40,000 words, and a novel starts at 60,000. So I'd written this thing that was in this no man's land. And so when my agent offered representation and gave me the 2 hours of notes, the first note was, you need to add 20,000 words. So I worked on that for a while, and then she submitted it for about a year and a half to the big 5 publishers, and then she wanted me to put it away, write the next book, let her sell the next book and then come back to this one. Because small publishers just, are not really lucrative enough for like the big agencies. And I said, I'm over 50 years old. Like, that sounds like a really long process. I finished this book already. Like, I think I'm just gonna go, if somebody else wants to publish this book, I'm gonna get it published. So I went to small presses and pretty quickly got offers from 2 of them and picked one of them, and then it was 2 years.
Wow.
It goes through copy editing, needs a cover, the inside has to be designed and set, and all of it has to be done with an advanced reader copy, I think like 8 months before the publication date, to send to the big review outlets to get reviews. So yeah, no, by the time the war started, this was on its way.
So just a real quick add-on to that, I haven't read it yet, but like, did the war, this last year, did it change your feeling about the book? How did you know what I mean? Like, now that it was already out there, and I don't mean just the war, but like life experience, it's out there for so long, how do you feel?
So
It lived with you, it stayed with you?
I mean, the question, because Mona, we do work together that has focused on the war in Gaza, which has been, very intense, like how that has affected how I experienced the book or this process. I mean, part of the book became very unimportant in a lot of ways. I mean, I just, I didn't really do very much for it. But in another way, it seems more important to me because it's, I think the themes that it deals with are extremely relevant in a different way. So, I didn't focus on it as much as I should, but I think if it was a different book than it is, like if the book that I was writing after this, before the war, is like a, humorous, creative nonfiction about weird animals that I've lived with. Like, I don't know that I would have had a lot harder time, and I have had a hard time focusing on that. Like, it's a little bit easier to focus on something that's dealing with grief and death while dealing with grief and death.
Thank you.
On that note.
And that book that you're working on what's the status of that? Do we get to read it soon? 2 years, 3 years?
Yeah. I mean, it's finished. I'm at the end of the editing process of it. I mean, honestly, if I could devote like 2 full days to it, it would probably be ready to go off to beta readers, and I just never do that. But part of it is also like it's hard to really kind of get into a funny headspace right now. But I hope I'm doing a writing residency in a few weeks, and if I'm not done with the editing by then, I'll be done by the end of it, and it'll go off to beta readers. But then it has to go either to my agent or to the publisher, and I need to decide if I want to go through a multi-year process to try to go to a big 5 publisher or not. But anybody wants to be a beta reader, I'll be looking for beta readers soon.
Thank you. Before we wrap, I just want to say we're going to have a little book launch party for the book, and we have a cake and snacks and drinks in the back. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Michelle. Congratulations.
Who this is helpful for, the cake is vegan and gluten-free, and for anybody who's not, just pretend that it's not. But it's from a really, really good bakery that just shut down 2 days ago. Erin McKenna used to be Baby Cakes. They made stuff for really, really good. So it should be good, whatever your dietary preferences are.
Michelle will be up here for signing.
All right.
The books are for sale back there, so There you go.
Thank you.